And welcome to Erie, Pennsylvania, to Jose Munoz and Reuben Jacobson. So glad to have you in our community here and to talk about such an important issue. And we'll drill down and talk about specifics, but Jose, somebody with your background and you're leading the Coalition for Community Schools Initiative, put broadly so that we can all start from a place and work in and focus, what are community schools?
That's always the most difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best here. But first, if I could, just really thank the Jefferson Education Society for inviting us and having this conversation. We feel, just as you do, a very important conversation to happen in this time of our country. And just like a community school, I want to thank, you need a backbone organization. So the United Way of Erie County, I want to really thank them as well for all the work that they're doing across Pennsylvania and Erie in particular, and why that's important, a little bit about myself so they know who they're talking to and why am I sitting on this stage, besides just the bios that you may read here. I work for the Institute for Educational Leadership, and so for about the last 60 years, the Institute for Educational Leadership has really prepared leaders across the country to disrupt generational poverty across race, class, and disability. And so one of the ways we do that is that we facilitate a coalition of community schools. For the past 25 years, I have been putting together and assembling coalitions across the country, in states and locally, just to bring people together around our young children. And so as a coalition, I became in this role the last 5 years. So a little context, I once was a community school director. That's the person whose job it is to wake up every day and bring people together to support our children. Getting into your question, that's one of the jobs of a community school director.
Where was that, before we get any further? Where were you active in a community school?
So actually, when I started my career in youth development, as a youth development professional, it was in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I have to say Nevada because I live in New Mexico. There's a Las Vegas, New Mexico. So don't get them confused. But in Las Vegas, Nevada, I actually worked in a nonprofit sector, the Boys and Girls Clubs. So working with schools and in schools throughout my career, I've been having a chance to actually just bring people together around the behalf of children. I entered the space through the out-of-school time space, much like the United Way here of Erie County enters the space, through their strength as well, too.
So you started in the field, and now you're leading the coalition. What would you say the most valuable thing that you learned in the field was that you apply to the work you do today?
So I want to build off of what Tim was saying earlier and talking about the wraparound services piece. Really important that I learned is how that comes about. First, identifying the people who are closest to the issues and getting them involved in the co-creation of solutions for their own community. Getting them involved and dreaming together of what that could be for their children and for themselves. And then co-locating that in a neighborhood, oftentimes a school, to make it accessible. So using a public school as the main source of a communication vehicle for broader community development. We realize that our families, generationally, we grew up in these communities, right? And so all that will, wealth, and wisdom that come from the generational families in the community comes together inside of a public school. A main job as a community school director is to make intentional connections, get folks to collaborate around the issues, and then coordinate the activities that will make sure people become better off.
Jose, so Reuben and Brian, I'm going to get to you in a second, but Jose, when I asked you the question, you said it's one of the hardest ones to answer. Why is it so hard to answer what community schools are?
Most people think of the tangential things you could come in and see and put together. And what is hard to see when you walk inside of a community school is how that happens, that type of engagement, because it's happening all day, every day. But what you will feel when you leave community school is a difference. There's many schools. My mom was a kindergarten teacher for 33 years. I went to school to become a teacher, worked inside of schools across my career, and I've seen some great schools with services that's already out there for children and their families. And I've seen some great schools who have great customer service. But the real difference is really the engagement and co-creation of folks. When you leave a community school, is the feel you have of just wanting to stay. It's oftentimes where a family, because of the effects of poverty, and I'm sure you'll see this, you see this all the time, they may move and become better off financially and move to a different section of town. but want to keep their kids at a school because of how it feels, how they're accepted, and how they're part of the planning of their children's education, and sometimes even their future, whether it be English language classes, whether it be community college classes, whether it be workforce development, that eliminates a barrier of transportation and childcare that a school could actually provide and co-locate an entire family in that night, not just the ones of age that go to the school, but their siblings as well.
So I want to talk about the approaches, and I want to get into how this addresses generational poverty and how it's an equitable model. But before I do that, Reuben, I want to turn to you. I know Jose said this was a tough question just to ask what are community schools, but if I had to ask you to sum it up in 6 words, what 6 words would you pick to describe community schools? Harder or easier?
It is hard. It is really hard to do. And I think like Jose was alluding to, go to a community school. Because we can talk about it, but when you go and you see it, everybody understands, because you see the children, you see the families, you see the student, you see the educators, you see the coordinator, and you see the work happening. But if you forced me to, I might say something like results-focused partnerships to transform schools, families, and communities. Yeah. And since we're in Erie, and to crush poverty.
You can use 2 of my words. I have 4.
So okay, Brian, same question. You can use the 2 words that Reuben took for you. What would you use 6 words to describe community schools in Erie, Pennsylvania here?
I would steal a phrase from Tim's opening remarks because it really hit home. It's level the playing field. These students have a lot of needs. They don't have the structures at home to succeed, and we see that in the test scores in the city and across the state. There's a direct correlation between student achievement on standardized tests and poverty. The more poverty that's happening in a school, the lower the test scores are going to be. So the community school model is a no-brainer to me. It just shows we need to wrap as many supports around these students and their families to remove those barriers to education so that they come to school ready to learn.
And so, Jose, going back to something, I want to pose this to all 3 of you. You said that you might not see it, you might not recognize the tangible things that are happening when you go into a community school. What should we look for? Those that perhaps might not have been in a community school or might have been in a community school and didn't know to look for something to see, this is a community school. And then in the community, the other side of that question, in the community at large, what do you start seeing that you say, this community has community schools? So what do you see in the specific school that we should look for? And what do you see in a community that's doing it successfully that you say, I see that happening. I know a community schools initiative is here.
I guess I'll take a stab. It won't be 6 words. Is that cool?
No, you can take more than 6. We'll take the cap off this one.
I would say you'll see a school become the very center for creating a community where people belong and they're working together and they're thriving. So when you see that happen, what do you picture? You see people in space working together. You see smiles on faces. You see them introducing themselves at grocery stores. You see children being fathered and mothered when they may not have a mother and father. That doesn't mean that they're not mothered and fathered. You'll start seeing those things. You'll see the results, having been a coordinator, right away. When people work that way, when you feel like you belong to something, when you work together, you can probably attest to this. Schools become irresistible. So the data you'll see right away is people start coming. Attendance can be eliminated. When school buildings start getting empty and they're irresistible, kids and their families will want to stay. Enrollment brings dollars, right? Enrollment brings dollars. When people start thriving, you'll see economies get better because parents become more skilled up and more confident in their own abilities. And even the local small businesses will have a factory of building their own local economy. You'll see those things happen as you come across the community schools and much more.
So Reuben, we're looking for as much as we can look for. What do you think we should look for inside a community school and then inside a community that has a community school initiative?
So in a community school, you're going to have a coordinator. We've got some of the coordinators and directors here.
Coordinators, directors, raise your hand. You're here with us. How about a round of applause?
Can they stand real quick? Can they stand? Can directors please stand? I gotta say it. Please stand, directors, community school directors. Let them see you. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the national picture. Go ahead.
So you'll see a person like these fabulous people that are here with us tonight, heroes in schools really, who are working hand in hand with principals and with community members to identify what the needs are in the community, to identify what the assets are in the community, what resources already exist, because every community has strength to draw upon. And you'll see the community involved in the decision-making of the community school as well. So it'll be done not to a community, but it'll be done by a community, and that's when you get the belonging that you heard Jose talking about.
So, Brian, what do you see in Erie's public schools that those of us here in Erie should be looking for? Changes that we've seen in the community because of the impact, but inside the actual buildings also, what should we look for?
Well, the change in the culture is just amazing to me, how things really do come together. As my colleague said, it really becomes a community and a focus for that community. The families come to the community school directors for any type of needs they have. If they have they need medical help, they need food, they need clothing. They know that they can come to the school and talk to the community school director and get directed to where those services are. But one of the most amazing transformations that I've seen as a superintendent is really the staff turnover in our buildings. So we have a union contract with our teachers, and we have a seniority-based process. So the more seniority you have, the more chance you get to bid to other schools. And what we saw years ago, that some of our schools that have some of the biggest challenges, and I'll use Piper, Burley, and McKinley as an example, you'd see a lot of churn among the staff because there'd be a lot of behavior problems, it'd be difficult to manage, and so new teachers would start out there, and when they had enough seniority, they would bid out to another school. We just don't see that anymore. The last 2 years, we only had two teachers bid out of McKinley and 2 teachers bid out of Piper Burley, and that's out of a staff of 30. So the turnover is non-existent, and they have options across the district.
And I think how powerful that is in a moment that we have right now when we think about the stresses on the educational system, public education, the stresses on teachers, and being able to provide a place for them where they want to stay, they have resources, they have access to that. One of the things that I want to pick up on, Jose, that you were talking about earlier was how to address generational poverty, create an equitable strategy, and how community schools is really a model for that. So I want to hear you first talk about that, Jose, of why community schools are an equitable strategy and for student success, how we're reaching across the poverty line and bringing students up. And then, Brian, I'm going to ask you about some local examples for that. So equitable strategy for student success. What do we see here with community schools?
As I was talking about before, in the generations of people coming together right here, we have, anytime you develop a city or a county and it's family housing, what do they come to you for? Where's the school gonna go? You have conversations with mayors and counties and things of that nature as far as the city planning might happen. Erie's already built up that way. You have generations of people who've been here. In those neighborhoods, there are families, 80 million across the country, who have the will to want to have their family do better, their kids, and also other families. They have a cultural wealth, regardless of what walk of life they come from. They have that, and then they have the ability to come and go out and help support people. When that comes together in a school, when you open the doors and include them in a co-creating process, anybody who owns a business and you do continuous improvement, you're going to include people in the process to get better. So those closest to the issue, to make it equitable, you got to measure even how much of them are you including in the decision process. And when they tell you where their pain points are and their gain points are, how readily are we make ourselves available and our resources available to shift towards where they're hurting right now, but also putting things in place so not staying there. What makes it really equitable, if we only stayed at delivering services, how most places are now, am I right? And in schools, if we only stayed there, we keep every family as a beneficiary. That does nothing for your entire community. But when you include people in the process and create access for them to get involved and be part of the solution, you move them to partners, you move them to contributors back to their community, and eventually they may take up their own cause and become leaders throughout. When that happens as confidence, we've all been there, myself included. I was a young parent. My first food stamp is right next to my desk. And look where I sit now. But that was only because there was a community who embraced me and my family. My mother became a teacher in her 30s. It wasn't something she dreamed about, raising 4 of us on the south side of Chicago. But because our schools gave us an opportunity, our communities embraced us kids in that neighborhood, I can tell you all my friends and my siblings are well off and better, and we're contributors now and leaders of our community. That's when it becomes equitable.
And Brian, on the local level, an equitable strategy for student success, what does it look like here in Erie?
And I go back to my 4 words. It really levels the playing fields for our students because it brings those supports in for both our students and their families to help them prepare to be ready to learn. One of the things that I've seen over the last couple of years too is there's such an advantage to partnering with United Way and the lead partners because we're bringing a lot of expertise into our buildings that we don't have as educators. And one of the things that one of our lead partners saw early on was that they were seeing a lot of mental health needs in the building, but we're not getting a lot of referrals from our student assistance process. So they came to us along with the United Way and explained this, and it caused us to revamp our entire student support structure within the district, hire a student support director, and really better align all of our internal systems to make sure that our students that needed that type of help were being referred out to the lead partners and the support network.
In thinking about equity and thinking about leveling the playing field, Jose, we know the importance of having teachers that look like the students they are teaching. How do we work to make sure that community school directors look like the communities they serve, have walked the path of the communities they serve? Because I appreciate you opening up about the food stamps and talking about that and being honest and showing where you are today. How do we address diversity when it comes to those that are working inside or at the street level doing this work?
This is not always the popular answer. Let me stress that. Diversity could be a very tough challenge, especially when you have generations of families growing up. You can't magically make them change the color of their skin. However, you could introduce multiple cultures to our young people and have them have a greater sense of diversity and inclusion and equity as they grow up. Example I give you, last Friday, I was in Prince George's County, Maryland, and I go visit a school, and I was being told on my way to that school that it's majority Spanish-speaking community. When I got to the school, I saw an all 100% African-American staff, except for the family engagement person. So I asked the question, tell me the story about the changes you faced in this community. Because there's a reason why you had an all African-American staff in the first place. And what they explained was how they were doing so well as far as moving people up that spectrum from beneficiaries to leaders in the community. As they became more fluent and better off, they began to move out, which it was a lower income area. The Spanish-speaking community came in. But they also explained from the administration to the staff, and you could feel it and with the kids, I get a chance to talk to the kids, how they shifted the way they operated. So how are you addressing that? Obviously, you can't fire everybody. Obviously, you can't just move folks around because that doesn't do well for kids either. But it was how I saw 2 cultures coming together for a common purpose. They were very intentional of how they were engaging a new arriving culture and population, but not leaving or embracing less the other culture that still remain. So I think you can achieve diversity, equity, inclusion. And yes, sometimes it is important for you to see someone who looks like you, but I'm being a realist. right now, that's extremely difficult to do from a superintendent standpoint, but what we can do is become more tolerant with each other. What we can do is learn more about each other, so when our kids do go out into the world, they're not shocked at what they see, but they actually embrace it. So how can we do that more? I would push the thinking to.
I think that's the $64,000 question, and are there examples of how we do that more, how we do that better? And before you answer that, I want to say, well, what is the popular answer? You know, if that's the unpopular answer, I think you're onto something there. What is the popular answer that most people would tell us?
Oh, Reuben, I have to ask that. Professor, you see that too? I don't know what the popular answer to that. I could tell you that I haven't heard a distinct solution. I don't know if you have in your travels.
No, but tell the story about, it's not just the coordinators, about the parents in Albuquerque who started the early childhood center. That was an example of people from the community taking on leadership roles, and they created it. They got certified to be early childhood educators.
That's something I was a part of. That's why you're telling me to tell the story. When I worked locally, Reuben actually used to work for the coalition and supported me when I was local. So now he's a professor and gets to tell me all what to do now. But so Albuquerque, New Mexico is where I live right now. It was a community where the community school, they were just beginning their community school work. And they were looking to see who they should hire as the community school, here I'll call director, because you all call them directors here, community school director. And I asked, who's the parent that always bothers you? Who's always knocking on your door? Who's the pestiest parent? And it was this young lady named Deanna, who was a white lady who didn't speak Spanish in the Spanish-speaking community where they were struggling with Spanish-speaking population coming. So I said, let's make her a coordinator. Well, she doesn't look like them, she doesn't talk to them, but she had the heart. The reason she was pounding on the door is because she was searching for the equity. So what happened, and I'll sum this up, what happened was, what we learned, Deanna actually shared a common experience with the Spanish-speaking moms who were new arriving citizens in our country right here. Deanna wasn't a citizen of the United States either. She was Canadian, so she knew the green card process, and she knew what she had to go through, so she was able to help. But in that process, the task was, how do we, from an equity standpoint, how do we engage? We're not getting the Spanish-speaking community, so go solve that. Long story short, they found a parent or two who spoke Spanish. They became the key levers in getting other parents involved. They designed early childhood development at the school because that was the reason why they couldn't get involved. But in that process, they started learning a new skill and trade themselves and became certified through lots of help and engagement by the broader community. And 14 of those moms received their associate's degree in early childhood. Here's the kicker in that process. So in our country, you can't go get a job just because you have a degree if you're not a citizen. Some of you small businesses may have that. However, the talent is still there. However, you can own a business. So 5 of the moms started their own business and started training other moms how to become early childhood providers themselves. And to this day, those moms, one of them now is a first grade teacher. 5 of them now still run that business inside of a community school in Albuquerque. And so that's some great equity right there. I'm glad you told us. There's a video, it's called the Preschool Co-op on YouTube. I wish I knew the link, but I can share it with you later.
And I asked you to bring it up because in community schools, you look around the community and there are tremendous assets everywhere. And the biggest asset is people. And so to answer your question, Ben, I mean, you draw from the people that are there as well as the people that you bring in to help out.
That's what makes it sustainable.
No, Jose, go.
No, I was just going to say, that's when people look about the sustainability of this, it's the people. It's the people who grew up it's the people who moved there, people who make that their home, who go shop in the stores, walk in the parks together. That's the sustainability piece of a community school.
I think that's such a common thread from town to town and city to city is when you ask residents, what's your greatest asset? 9 times out of 10, people say the people. You know, they don't point to something else. They don't point to an industry. They say the people. That's what makes the community. Looking at it at a national level, Reuben, I want to go to you for a second. And part of what we're looking at here is a model locally, a model nationally. Why are community schools having such a moment nationally? How's the movement growing? And then how is it doing that?
So if you didn't know, community schools are having a moment nationally, which is great. It's been a long time coming, but the first reason why is because it happened locally. Because communities like Erie all around the country for 20 plus years, and even further back, going back to John Dewey, have been making schools the center of the community, have been establishing community school initiatives, oftentimes in partnership with United Way, with cities, with counties. And that good idea has grown. People have spread that idea, and we've learned about it together and we've shared. But then you can't always just have a good idea. That's not always going to be enough to get the national scale that you want. So you have policies that have been created at city level. You have state policies. California just passed, $4 billion for for community schools. I'm not saying everybody can do that, but that's great. And then around Pennsylvania, there's got to be 15 communities that are doing this work at some degree. That all bubbles up, and of course you've got the president who's made this a part of his effort and agenda in education, but community schools really have grown over the last 20 years regardless of politics. During the Bush years, that's when the full service community school grant, the federal grant, first came into being, which helped spread community schools as well.
And sticking with that for a second with national politics, what is the Department of Education doing right now in embracing this or using this? Reuben, while you answer that, I think, folks, it might just be me, but I think I'm having a microphone issue, so I'm going to switch out a different microphone, so hopefully you can hear me. So Reuben, the Department of Education, their involvement in this from a national perspective, federal government, what can it do?
Yeah, so the federal government has a grant program that it's been around since, I think, 2008, that has given dozens of grants around the country. But community schools have also been included in the recovery fund allowances, in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So federal legislation has enabled local communities to make local decisions and say, yes, you can use funds to support community schools, and plenty of communities have done just that.
And we've taken advantage of the federal funding. The United Way spearheaded a grant application that actually funded case managers for all 5 of our original community schools. And when the pandemic hit and we started receiving stimulus funds, we saw the advantage of having those case managers in our buildings, and we're able to use those funds to expand that to all of our community schools.
Add to that?
Please do. Please do as we're checking out my microphone.
Sure, check 1, 2, there you go. But nationally, the movement isn't growing solely because of us working on a national level. It's growing because of what you said. You talked about actually the execution of that quote. I was going to ask you about what is the purpose of Jefferson Educational Society? What is that purpose?
So this is a great conversation that Jose and I were having earlier about the work that we do here, and I started to explain to you part of just based on our namesake, Jefferson. So not Jefferson the person, but Jeffersonian education, the idea that if you can educate a citizenry, they can be trusted with their own democracy, lowercase d, their own government, and that really that was the spirit behind the movement to create the Jefferson Educational Society, was that Erie needed and wanted a place like this where adult lifelong learning can happen, and we can talk about a range of issues. Just last night we're looking at the future of trade skills. Tonight we're looking at community schools. Tomorrow we look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and the UK, and you get all of that at the Global Summit, because if we're more educated, all of us, then we're better, all of us. So we're trying to address that at an adult level. What can we do in this discussion for community schools in terms of educating the citizenry? Where do we fit in? How do we fit in educating all of us?
And that was described some. So right now, your community school directors in the United Way of Erie County is doing that right now. I just arrived today and had lunch. And since lunch, I have learned how fast you all are bringing people together around children. And you just heard the impact. You changed the way a school district operates. And you got that information from how the multiple, as you grew, you received more information of how you can improve the operations of the school district so young people and families are better off. Is that what I was hearing?
That's correct.
That's correct. So you're putting that quote, you're putting another Jefferson quote that I love. He said, Jefferson the person, not Jefferson the principle. He said, a strong democracy depends on a well-informed electorate. So if you have people who wake up every day getting the feedback from every neighborhood in your community, the more it informs decision makers like yourself and mayors and things. So you're putting democracy, small d, into action right now in Erie. And it didn't take long. I kept hearing, finally, the words finally, or it took us this long. And I had to have them quantify for me how long you talking about, because we just spent 2 years of the whole world trying to figure out nobody doing well inside of a pandemic. So you're really speaking about just a few months of working, still coming out of what we're coming out of and getting people back together, and you're already seeing results. And this is real-time Erie. So this is happening across the country. Reuben's talking about from 25 years, and Reuben was with the coalition 10 years. 10 years of that, 25 have been the last 5 years, but I've been a part of the coalition as a local. And the reason it's growing nationally is because of communities like yours. We're seeing results. Locally, I couldn't have grown community schools from 1 to 61 in Albuquerque without actually producing some results of families and communities. Nobody's gonna give me money for just being nice. You know, so this is why it's growing and why the funding from the Bush administration to the Biden administration keeps multiplying in the different states, from California, it's $4 billion, to Florida, $7.2 million. Red, blue, this is a purple endeavor. It just makes sense to use the greatest communication vehicle to address the 51% of our student population who are living in poverty right now, to engage them in the process of doing better. That's democracy. It just makes sense. And that's why it is starting to grow. Politically now, because it is on a presidential platform, we're gonna hear the attacks, because they're trying to politicize it. But if you keep it at people, it just makes sense.
Do you see bipartisan support for this, or are there fractures along political lines? Not getting too political, I think we've got to ask that question these days of, does this have bipartisan support, and do we see opposition coming from any particular direction?
We do. Bipartisan support, like I told you about Florida, and I'll blend the attacks. You know, Arizona state legislator last year, the total Republican legislator, they were going to adopt community school policy. Some media came out about them adopting communist community schools, and when you read the article, it had nothing to do with communism. But the headline killed it. But you know, I hear they're going to try it again this year. So it is Arkansas, you know, Governor Asa Hutchinson and a Republican legislator in Arkansas passed legislation. Actually, New Mexico, where I live, it's a blue state, but when the first state policy got passed, it was a Republican administration in New Mexico. So yeah, you see bipartisan, so we're starting to see co-opting of the message from different sides. You know, I'm not saying it's one side or the other. You start seeing a co-opting of the message, the overplay of services rather than community program rather than people. You start seeing the overplay of that, which is diluting the real power and message. So part of my role and my job is to help try and balance that. And I'll go back to a question you asked Reuben, is like, what is this administration doing? Hopefully, my personal goal is like, hey, party, whatever you do, we can do better. to support community schools, that's the goal for 2024. But the goal for 2024, this administration currently, because of communities like yours, helping to inform, my job, I call myself the community school national cheerleader, but I get, as far as the director of the coalition, I operate like a community school. I'm asking local communities, we have about almost 60, Jolene is right there, 50 plus communities coming together, in a couple of weeks in Asheville, North Carolina, representing 28 different states. And so we get informed because I get calls at 7:30 in the morning from the White House administration education policy directors and say, what could we do? So what we are guiding them to do is to act and operate as efficiently as you are if we're informing them. So they're looking at not just Department of Education funding, but how do we operate more efficiently as a government to support the democratization for people, small d.
And so I think two of the words I would use out of the 6 to say what community schools are is not communist. So I'll start there. But I think part of how we show the success of that is looking at the academics of it. And I know that community schools remove non-academic barriers. But Reuben, I want to go to you, the academic, and say what has to be in place academically to move the needle, and then for the general public to have seen the needle move.
Yeah, so if you remember my definition, I started with results-focused partnership. This is a results-driven strategy. It's good to get together and talk about things and figure out how we can help people, but sometimes it's just talk. The focus is on results, and that's attendance, that's achievement, that's getting teachers to stay in the classroom, to stay in the school. All of those results matter, and the programming, the strategy has to drive towards that. So what do you need? You need to have the community school coordinator or director working hand in hand with the principal, the education leader of the school site. You need to have them working with teachers. I came to community schools from a teacher. I was a teacher in DC public schools beforehand, and I remember I would have the after-school provider drop a survey in my box and ask me to fill it out, and that was the extent of the coordination. No. You need somebody, community school people who are working hand in hand with the educators who are the primarily responsible for learning to help enhance that learning. You need youth voice. We know that, I've got kids, I'm sure lots of people here have kids, they're interested in the things they choose to be interested in. So let's ask them what they're interested in, and let's get partners that can help enhance their learning. I heard examples of that today here in Erie with some of the partners, doing experiments that mattered to students because it was happening in real time. You see those things happen, and then you see results happen. You also need to have a well-implemented community school strategy. So a couple examples. So New York City had a major evaluation of community schools, and one of the most famous examples of community school evaluations happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Both of those evaluations first looked at how well the community school was being implemented. Was there a community school coordinator? Was there trust? Was this work happening? Before they expected to see any results. And because they implemented it so well, they did see results. Attendance went up, chronic absence went down, and in Tulsa's case, achievement went up. In New York's case, achievement went up. I don't think statistically significantly, but it went up. It's going in the right direction. And it's hard. If you're not focused on learning, you're not going to see those results no matter how many barriers you remove.
And so let's put the local context on that. Brian, how are we seeing that measured locally in the outcomes here in Erie? How are we vetting curriculum change? How are we seeing outcomes move in a positive direction with the community schools?
It's been a challenge for the school district over the last decade. As you know, we've come out of our financial crisis. We went into that in 2011, so for more than a decade, you've heard the adage, building a plane while it's still flying. It's been like that only on the front end with the financial crisis. We were deconstructing that plane while it's flying down to the bare minimum parts needed to fly. And then when we received our additional funding, our first round of additional funding in 2017, we had to reverse course and start to build back and build back better with the community school programs and that curriculum, the standards-aligned curriculum, which is something that we've never had as a district. We didn't have the funding to refresh our curriculum, our books. A lot of our books back in 2017 were 25 years old. So I'm happy to report today that because of the funding received over the last couple years, we've refreshed almost every one of our curricular areas and built that standard aligned curriculum, spending over $9 million to buy the materials and train our teachers. So again, for the first time, I think, in history, when you go into an elementary school, a first grade elementary classroom in McKinley Elementary, they're teaching pretty much the same thing at the same time as an elementary classroom over at Piper Burley. So that's been a big move for us. We're still implementing it, so it's going to take a little time to actually roll that out. But again, we have all the structures now in place to start moving the needle as far as the numbers go. And the community school model is a big part of that. I mentioned an instructional leader at the helm. Having the community school director in that building really frees up that principal's time to focus on instruction, which is what we want them to do. Really focus on moving that needle and moving our kids forward.
So I want to talk for a second about the target for the community schools model, because we're talking nationally, and I want to talk about the difference between an urban approach and a rural approach. Are their cities too large? Are their towns too small as we see this, and then how that works across the divide between urban and rural? Before I do, though, I want to encourage folks in the audience, we want your questions as well. Our team is now going around collecting some questions. They're going to run them up to me, and I'll start incorporating those. We'll get through as many as we can, but I want to involve you in this conversation as well. But let's talk urban-rural divide. Are there cities too large where this just simply wouldn't work? Are there towns too small where it couldn't happen? What's the target for community schools? Reuben, can I go to you for that?
I mean, the rural has always fascinated me, and I think just because it seems like it should be harder, but it happens. It still happens because rural communities, in my opinion, have been sort of de facto community schools long before they knew what to call a community school. The school is the center of the community. The institutions that are there, of which there are institutions, there are strengths, as I've been saying, I've always mobilized around the school. So putting the coordinator, you just get the official stamp, so to speak. But I feel like they've been doing the work already, and now they can just do it better. As far as too big, I mean, we're seeing community schools in New York. How many? I mean, hundreds.
400 now. Started off like 200.
LA.
The study was done was 200. Now they're at 400 something.
LA is going to be most of LA, I think.
Most of California.
Most of California, the high poverty schools. The state of Maryland, every school that's a high poverty school is a community school. Every school in the state. So, scale, we're going to be learning a lot, Ben. Quite frankly, we're going to be learning a lot about what this looks like in different communities. But that scale allows you to do something really special. And you have that in Erie. Every elementary school, every middle school, that's the transformation that I was talking about.
So Reuben, I'll ask this to you first, and Brian, I'll point it to you. Are you seeing now in the observation of it, identifiable challenges that are common threads from schools to schools? It doesn't matter their size. If they have this challenge present, it's just tougher. Because you said you thought it might be tougher in the rural area, but yet it wasn't. So what sort of obstacles have you seen? And then I think that opens to the question of how are we working through those obstacles? But what are some of the barriers or challenges that you've seen in the implementation of the community schools model?
I mean, resources are, of course, a barrier. Like, let's not kid ourselves and say if we just all sat around a table, we could figure everything out. That's nice, and you will figure out a lot, but it still takes money to pay for after-school programs, for a health clinic, for mental health services. That's why you have the grants, right? So resources are always going to be a part of the challenge. What community schools allow you to do is to find resources that are out there already and use them more efficiently. I think you were talking about efficient use of government resources or other funding streams, and to leverage and to braid funding. So you invest in the coordination, you leverage those additional dollars for the community school. So resources is a big one.
So Brian, what do you see as obstacles here in Erie's public schools, and how are you navigating through them?
Well, I think a common theme throughout all of our community schools is attendance, and it's actually an initiative in every one of our community school plans. So that's something that we're through this model are taking head on. I think a couple examples of some of the initiatives that we're working with is the walking school bus. Again, that's something as the United Way, as the backbone organization, they were able to identify in talking to the community school directors that a safe route to school was a barrier to kids getting to school. So they partnered with a local university to identify some of the routes that would be the safest for our students to walk to school, and then also partnered with one of our local organizations, the Blue Coats, last year to really create a walking school bus at a couple of our schools where the Blue Coats would be at certain intersections at certain times in the morning, and the kids could jump on that walking school bus and walk with an adult to school.
And we've seen that walking school bus initiative in other cities work as well. So we see, again, a national impact there of this is something that can be done. Communities embrace this and take this on. When we use the word long-term strategy, I think sometimes people think this is going to take a while, and they might think like flip a switch. We're going to see community schools move in. We're going to fix that school in this year. We can't wait. But how do we get people to either, I don't want to say temper expectations, but know that this is a long-term strategy, that this isn't going to undo decades of issues overnight. Jose, can you talk about that from the national perspective? And then Brian, I want to go to you for the local perspective. But how do you get people on board with a long-term strategy for this?
You're good at asking questions that I may answer controversially, right? We were talking about this as well. If I could just add on a quick challenge as well too. I think some mindsets are challenges. This is the way we've always done it, so we don't change. We get stuck in our own ways. I don't have time. I'm too busy to be efficient. Right? This is crazy. The under-resourced. We're still having a conversation from when my mom grew up and having to pay for her own supplies. I mean, come on. We can't buy books. we want kids to be modernized to today's world and the future. I mean, come on, some of these things are kind of crazy in these mindsets we have there, but time frame wise, how we address that is getting people involved. What I've learned here just today, working with the United Way and listening to United Way of Erie County staff, and the directors that work here, I kept challenging them in their conversation. They'll tell you, right? The challenge, because I was hearing, they started seeing some academic results in 3 years. In 3 years. And it's scary to say that because then we put ourselves on the hook of actually producing something. But if you think about it, coming from a kid growing up in poverty, it can't take long because I might not be there. So how can we resource the engagement part of people fast enough and make the resources and which includes funding more agile to be responsive? If I ran my own business, and what's not on my resume is I did work for number 15 Forbes Fortune 100 most desired places to work for. Most desired places to work for, right? So when they wanted to improve, what do you think they did? They asked us. They asked our customers. And what do you think they did with their money? They moved it quick, right? Which helped me make more money. Make me more money. We don't do that with tax-based dollars or even our own money that we contribute as donors. I tithe to my church now. I want them to move that money fast to help somebody right now. We don't do that in this space.
I think that, so I love that answer because it reminds me of the pesky parent that suddenly is in charge. One person's pesky is another person's passion, and you find creative solutions to difficult problems. And I think the through line there is listen to people, and actually get them involved. But Brian, I want to pose it to you locally of how are you dealing with that? When on the one hand we've got long-term strategy, on the other hand we've got to move fast and be agile.
Yeah, and I think I want to use Pipe for Burley as an example because they're one of our original community schools, and they actually have had a standard aligned curriculum for much longer than our other schools. So back in 2013, they were identified as a comprehensive support school by the federal government, which means that their performance was in the bottom 10% in the state. And that's a terrible designation to get, but with that came some additional federal funding. and it gave us an opportunity to do some changes. So the first thing that we did was replace the principal with a strong instructional leader. We tapped Karen Ryan, who took over in 2014 and actually implemented standards-aligned curriculum for both math and English language arts. In addition, she worked to develop a data-driven cycle of improvement with our teachers, and then in 2016, the community school model kicked in, and we rolled that out at Piper Burley. So if I fast forward to 2018-19, and that's the last year before the pandemic, their average daily attendance went from 91.7% to 95.2%. I've got to throw out a few numbers tonight. You know, I'm a CPA, but the number of students present, 90% more or more during the school year, is at 82.4%. That's more than their goal, their state set goal of 80.9%. Their behaviors in the building went from 1,785 to 919. That's a 50% drop. And their number of students that are proficient or advanced on the PSSA, we saw a small increase there. It went from 24.9 to 26.7. But that really doesn't tell the whole story, because we have a lot of kids that are way below grade level. And when you look at the PSSA scores, there's 3 different designations. There's advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. And when she took over back in 2013, 54% of the students in that school were at below basic, the lowest performing in the state. That has moved in that time period from 54.6 to 35.2. So we're moving the needle, and that's really the goal, and the long-term goal is to move all kids. We can't stay focused on that proficiency and advance. We need and look to try to move 1 or 2 kids across that line every year. We need to continually move all of our kids up, and in long term, that's how this is going to make a difference in our community. But again, this is...
Yes. What was the time frame again? What was the time frame?
This is a 10. This is a 10
to what?
To
those numbers.
2018-19. So it's a 5 or 6 year period before we started to see some movement.
Can I put some continuous improvement perspective on that from the private sector? Who's our private sector folks in here? Any Six Sigma geeks in here? Yeah, I saw some hands raised. So you know if you're a Six Sigma geek, when you control all the widgets, when you control all the employees, they say you can expect a 10% improvement in 2 years. They're blowing that out. And they don't control people. They engage people. That's...
So 2 things. 1, excellent questions as always from the audience. 2, excellent penmanship. I can read most of them. We're going to try to get through as many as we can. We have some additional questions. And I guess my third observation is excellent attendance, because this person clearly was here last night and heard Tom Bodette, woodworker, talk about the future of trade skills. And I said Tom Bodette, woodworker, because I think when we say the name Tom Bodette, most people might think about I'm Tom Bodette, and we'll leave the lights on for you at Motel 6, right? Or you might have heard him on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, or you might have read his books as a humorist. But he talked about the importance of trade skills and coming to terms with that. And this person is wondering what the role of trade skills are in a community schools initiative, and if there's something that's happening locally around that, re-embracing trades. How does community schools approach that, think about that, deal with that?
Can I pick on Reuben? Because Reuben just wrote an article for Brookings Institution, and you were talking about Messina, New York, and some of the schools in the rural community. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm not sure they deal with trade,
how
but that was
they're reimagining, though.
That was about superintendent leadership. I don't remember the example you're talking about specifically. What about trade?
Messina, New York, which is right across the St. Lawrence River from Canada. When they started the community school work, it was about economic recovery.
Yeah, for them it was the why. It was the why. They were a community where the economy was really suffering, and they needed to turn things around. And like we heard at the opening, it has to happen with people. It has to happen with schools, and that's why they embrace the community school strategy.
Yeah, but I think regardless of the whether it be trade schools, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be finances, I think when you address and engage the community, as Reuben is talking about, it could be anything that community needs to solve and be part of that solution. Where community schools, when you co-locate things and use it as an engagement strategy, you have a chance of improving that or growing whatever it is you want. I don't know of any personal examples of trade skills in particular. I don't know.
Brian, then Reuben.
We have a trade school at Erie High. That's not one of our community schools, but it's one of our current goals is to get that moved to a community school model within the next couple of years. I would love to see that happen. We still have a lot of openings in our trade programs. They're doing great work over at that school. It's hard to get kids to understand the importance of moving into those programs and what type of careers they can get right out of high school because of those programs. So having those additional supports at Erie High would, again, help us direct the kids that would most benefit from those type of programs into them so that they can move on and have a successful career after graduating.
Yeah, community schools are about doing partnerships really well, and adult education happens in community schools. Community schools go back, as I said, to John Dewey, who saw the school at the center of the community. That meant if you're needing to learn trade, you can do that at the school site, which is a central institution. Just on the way here, driving here from Buffalo today, I heard a story about a school that was partnering with the trucking industry, right? All these trucking jobs that we know are going to be open around the country. Well, they got the trucking training to happen inside the school, so when the students were 18, they could get these good jobs. That's partnership. It happens better in a community school, I think, in our opinion, but that's one way.
You reminded me, so there's a school in Des Moines, Iowa, you should check out. Because they have something like, and forgive me because it was like 2018 when I went to go visit it, and I've seen a lot of schools, by the way. I've seen a lot of schools, but there is a school in Des Moines, Iowa that's a community school, and they're doing some amazing things around
It's good to know. Okay. Thanks.
We'll connect you.
So make that note, Des Moines, Iowa, Erie, Pennsylvania. We're going to connect those two. Somebody also thinking about other examples and asking, what's the role of charter schools in this? Do we see charter schools involved in the community schools initiative?
We do. What's the role of any institution that cares for kids? What's the role of any institution that can communicate with families? Wouldn't it be the same? If operating in such way? That's the short answer. Do we see charter schools doing community schools? Yeah. We see some doing really great, where we see some of the results we see in regular traditional public schools as well. Where we see the challenges sometimes is when charter industry isn't working well and in unison with school districts in an area, and we see the inefficiencies of our dollars, our tax-based dollars, our philanthropic dollars, in serving the kids in unison with each other within a community, because those kids and those families are going to travel to grocery stores and workplaces no different. The structure, as a parent of 5, I want to know if my kid is safe and are they learning something when they go to school. So I think sometimes we get in a debate of public, charter, private, what have you, but if the responsibility of all of us is around our children, we'll look for the best ways to use our resources the most efficiently so our children are taken care of and they grow ready to be successful.
And so this person's asking now, 3 most important services provided by community schools, 3 most important things that the coordinators or directors do. You can divide it up and each take one if we're still on numbers. So what do you think the most important thing that community schools do, and then in terms of the services they offer, and then the most important thing that coordinators or directors do?
I think the most important thing is connecting students and families with whatever services they need to succeed and remove those barriers, whether it's inside the school, additional academic supports or mental health supports, or outside in the community with some of our social service providers.
I know you have a whole stack of questions. Ask those folks over there.
Right, coordinators want to take a stab at it. Do one of you guys ask that hard question? No. I would say understand that the number one important thing for a community school director is understanding you're the facilitator of the process or not the implementer of programs. That's number one. Number two, quantify your engagement of those who are struggling the most. It's one thing that we serve and survey and serve a number of people, but if you want to have greater gains, who are the struggling the most, and what percentage of them are actually contributing now or becoming contributors in our community in this process. And the third thing I would say is the most important thing from an administrator support, prepare people for it. You know, from a school district support, from a community support, how do you get folks on board on understanding their role on how they contribute? We all can volunteer. We all can contribute something, regardless of how much money we have or where we live. Anybody can do that, so getting people exercising their own gifts and talents to care for other people.
And so we do have a stack of questions, and we're going to try to get through as many as possible, but it's still not too late. If you have a question, jot it down, and we'll try to add it into the mix as we wrap up our conversation here. Inevitably, we're not going to get to everything, and there's so many great resources out there, including, if you didn't get it on your way in, a wonderful brochure from the United Way of Erie County that describes this, and we'll touch more on how to get in touch with tonight's presenters and a chance to talk to them. But somebody is asking, in plain speak, describe the process of becoming a community school. How does it happen?
Plain speak?
Plainest speak you've got for us.
Use a number. Kids aren't coming. You said attendance is an issue. Get a group of people who care about kids together and say, why is that happening? And what are we going to do about it? And then start doing it. There's your plain speak.
So this is coming from a current student who asks, do you have plans on making high schools community schools?
Yes.
Plain speak, that's a great answer.
Plain speak.
So follow up, when?
As soon as we can find the funding.
I was going to say, was that on the card?
As moderator, I'm allowed to follow up on something. I think that's an important one. So again, I think that's back to the important thing of finding partnerships and finding the funding for this. And one of the questions, Jose, this is specifically to you, is asking about connection to the Boys and Girls Club. Do you see the Boys and Girls Club as a viable partner and collaborator with the community schools or not? So looking at collaborators, partners, ways to get more people involved, where funding can come from, specifically Boys and Girls Club. And then Reuben, I want to ask you, where are we seeing success in finding the funding for community schools initiatives?
So one, where Boys and Girls Club is specific, do I see them as a viable partner? Yeah, I see everybody as a viable partner. I see the parent who's stressed out how I'm gonna feed my kids tonight as a viable partner. So yes, I see that. Where we get the funding from, let's turn our pockets inside out. Well, so one thing, I'll say this about the funding side, and hopefully this makes just common sense, and this goes to the resources a little bit as well too. Tax-based dollars, philanthropic dollars, whether it's individual philanthropic, foundation, or have you, that's going towards a purpose of serving people, that's happening now. It's going to the same kids that we are talking about now who have the highest concentrations of poverty, which is called a school-wide Title I school, right? That's the fancy name. School-wide Title I school, which means you have the highest concentrations of poverty, of young people in poverty going to that school, correct?
Every one of our elementary and middle schools.
And you have services now for folks. The big difference in the cost is it goes implemented unintentionally. And I think one of the things what I'm hearing you saying and what I saw today from United Way of Erie County is the intentionality of using the existing resources to have a greater outcome, and they have a plan per school to actually measure it towards identified shared goals. That type of intentionality makes whatever the amount is, makes it make sense. In Albuquerque, and Reuben knows this too, we went from 1 to 61 schools. Our first amount, I was the first executive director there. We had $250,000. By the way, New Mexico is the poorest state in the nation. We compete with Mississippi, all things bad in education. So we got you off the hook there. Got you off the hook there. We went from one community school to 61, $250,000 to $5.9 million this year with no new money, no outside money. That's the city, the county, the school district, the United Way, the university, the Chamber of Commerce, and any individual wants to get involved of sitting down and doing the hard work of how do we make what we have work for young people and benefits. And you'll see some anomalies happening data-wise in Albuquerque. Rand hasn't come to study yet. I'm jealous. We'll get him over there. But you'll see some anomalies. And nationally, just to make this make sense, to go to that national context here, we have a huge goal with the Coalition for Community Schools to have 25,000 community schools by 2025. People often ask, how many community schools are there now? And there's always been a number of about 5,000 to, I've seen anywhere from 10,000. We're in a process right now of doing a census of how many community schools out here. But this is not just an aspirational goal. This just is a make sense goal based off of what I told you about the dollars out there towards young people. Right now in our country, pre-pandemic in our country, well, right now in our country, there's about 98,000+ schools, about 13,000 plus school districts. Out of that 98-something thousand schools, about 24,000 are school-wide Title I schools. So about 24,000 pre-pandemic, about 24,000+ schools across our country have the highest concentrations of youth of poverty, which means all those different dollars and funding streams are going towards those schools. So if anybody knows anything about critical mass, or you read the book Malcolm Baldrige, Tipping Point, you'll understand critical mass theory. So this is a make sense goal, which means if we can get 25 to 30% of something, this time we're talking about public schools, operate efficiently within a good time frame, it won't be long until all things, whatever it is, now we're talking about schools, begin to operate that way. So you can measure how many school-wide Title I schools you have here in your area. You can measure how much does it cost to pay a community school director a salary where they're not worried about their job the next day, and how long you can provide that. You can measure that, and then you'll see more and more of the outcomes you have. So that's the make sense goal we have for the country, and that's kind of the make sense way you guys can help us out in Erie to address that.
So, Jose, thank you for that. And I think we could talk about funding and the hope for funding and how we get there for a long portion. And I want to get through as many of these as we can. So Reuben, I'm going to change the topic and still go to you, though, and ask what this person's asking, which is the impact of the pandemic on community schools. Well, what did that look like nationally? Where are we now?
The impact, I mean, in community schools was just like it was in every school. We were devastated. Schools around the country, families around the country were devastated. I don't need to tell all of you. The difference is that community schools were ready to be able to address the issues that the pandemic exposed and the pandemic caused, which, by the way, we're still in. So that, when we talk about schools, community schools that have food pantries, and then the pandemic comes, students aren't going to school, and they need access to food, you have a coordinator and you have partners who know the community, and are then able to deliver those services and supports.
So Brian, a question for you on numbers, and we have two specifically for you. One, how many students right now in Erie's public schools are enrolled in a community school? I know that's a specific question, even if you just give us a round number. People in the audience are curious, how many students are partaking in this here? And I think that flows really nicely off of what Jose was just saying with the expansion of this effort. So locally, what does the footprint look like?
It's about 7,500 of our 10,000 students. So the vast majority.
Impressive number with more to come as we look to add the high schools. Brian, another question for you, if I could stick here. Can you or a community school director give some examples of parents, we're back to the parents and their involvement in it, who have been brought into the community schools concept, who have bought in to the community schools concept based on successes that they have seen? What does that conversation look like with the pesky parent, the skeptical parent, somebody who maybe wasn't in on this but now sees that success? What does that look like?
Can I get one of you guys to answer that?
We can try to run you down my faulty microphone, or Brian can pass his. Sorry, folks, we're going to call in audible. We're going to do this. This is important. We get to hear from a community schools director. Could you say your name for everybody, if you don't mind?
Sure. Megan Easter, Piper Burley Elementary. So I think the pesky parent is usually the parent that has the loudest voice, but is speaking for a large majority of the population. And so what I think we've found at Piper Burley specifically is early on we had a lot of parents voicing externally some of their concerns, but those are the same parents we're partnering with to hear their voice at a different platform. So they're the ones that are giving us insight and ideas on the front end, so their voice is shared at the table, so they're not coming to us at the back end concerned about something. So we're partnering with them and bringing their voice to the table instead of just having them receive something we're developing without them. If that answers the questions, yeah.
Thank you for that, and I think that flows back into what we heard Reuben say earlier. Do this with a community, not to or for a community. Do it, by the community. The community is doing this, so we see that inclusive approach.
You ask what you see in a community school. One of the most vivid images I have from my travels is a rainy day in Cincinnati visiting a school, and it was a school site committee that was discussing how to start an early childhood center in their community. They had the resources, they had the partner, they were ready to go. But it was the parent who was sitting at the table who said, if you do it this way, it will my peers will never buy into it. We have to do this, this, and this. You have to have that person at the table.
And so I think thinking about that involvement, I want to ask this question, but before we nearly wrap up here, thinking about that ripple out effect of what happens then in the community around a community school. And I think this person's thinking about the conversation that we were having about democracy, lowercase d here. Can you describe successful citizenship engagement in local communities around community schools? What does that look like? Reuben, we'll start with you. Jose, we'll go to you. And then Brian, we'll pick you up on the end, what that looks like local.
I think when people see schools as the trusted public institution that it's meant to be in the center of their community, they know it's a place they can go to, they know it's a place that they can go play soccer, they can go vote, they can go use the library. If they have a health clinic, they could have a health clinic. It becomes this place of congregation where we're learning together, we're understanding together, where they're going in. I mean, my goodness, if we had a JES in every community school, that would be that's an incredible vision for us all to hold, by the way. That would be an ideal.
We'll talk to you about that expansion.
Yeah, that's
effort.
great.
Let's coordinate. Brian, what does that look like locally? And then Jose, we'll round out with you.
Well, one of our goals in our strategic plan is to create civic-minded students, and one of the initiatives in that is we want to have each of our students, 100% of our students, volunteer in a meaningful way in the community. So pre-pandemic, we started to do that, and the community school directors obviously have the connections with the community partners, know what is needed specifically within the school community, and help coordinate some of those activities.
Jose, what does that look like to you?
So, like you gave a visual, so recently during the pandemic, when we were going through the pandemic, we had a census, the United States Census. So a census impacts the next 10 years of funding of your community, within your community. So we've been, like as you're describing, a set of community school directors in Albuquerque got together and realized this, and we're informing parents of what this could mean if we don't take the census in an area that typically didn't do well in census anyway. Well, during the pandemic, they actually increased their census participation, I think by 6 to 12% during the pandemic. So they just impacted their PUMA, the per 100,000 area within a census, millions of dollars over the next 10 years. So that was parents getting out and knocking on the doors, and directors understanding that and educating people what this could mean at this moment. Yeah, we're in a pandemic, but how important do you want this to impact us the next 10 years? So I think that's the most vivid example I could think of, most recent as well.
So often is the case when we have a panel full of passionate, bright, energetic people, time is against us and we run out of it. And we're almost out of it here. And I know we didn't get through all of the audience questions, and I thank you for all of your questions. We didn't get through all of my questions. And clearly this is a conversation we want to keep going. The last question that I want to ask you, and I'll pose it and then I'll say a few things to the audience so we can hold our applause to the end after your question with some housekeeping notes, is what's the most important thing on your mind that we didn't get a chance to talk about tonight that folks need to hear about before they leave the room? And Brian, I wanted to start with you, and then Reuben and Jose will close with you. But before they answer that question, I want to thank you all for your time, your attention, your effort and energy to get here tonight to be a part of this conversation. I think the thing we've heard the most is community involvement and voices and inclusion. Your being here tonight is a big part of that. So we're grateful for you, the audience, for attending this. Then, of course, the Global Summit is far from over. In fact, tomorrow night we have a new program. We'll have Dr. Fiona Hill coming in. She'll be at Gannon University at the Highmark Center. If you have tickets to that, terrific. Make sure you go in the Peach Street entrance right there into the gymnasium. If you don't have tickets, our staff is here to help you. Also our website, jeserie.org. And of course, there are 4 programs coming up next week too. We're taking a look at James Madison. We're taking a look at transatlantic relationships to save democracy. We're taking a look at the Our Towns Initiative and learning about what's happening at towns and how they're writing the future of the nation's narrative. And then also we're taking a look at Madison and Adams and Milton with our own Reverend Charles Brock. Before we take a pause here in Erie, we head to California and then we come back to Erie. So a lot more to come, folks, and that's what you can tune in for. But again, thank you, and thanks to all of our sponsors to make this all possible, especially Erie Insurance and our partners for these events, like the United Way of Erie County, which if you did not get it, grab one of these on the way out. Now that final question, what didn't we get to that you have to say tonight that folks hear and they walk away with thinking about? What didn't we get to that's on your mind that we have to talk about as quickly as you can, Brian?
So there's been a lot of good news about our finances in the media lately, and we have received some additional funding from the state, which helped to start to level the playing field, but it's not all rainbows and unicorns at the Erie School District. We're still identified as one of the 100 most underfunded schools in the state, despite having that additional funding. Right now, our state and local funding on a per-pupil basis is in the bottom 30%, despite us being in the top 2 to 3% for poverty, charter enrollment, English language learners, and special education. So I just want to, again, reiterate how important it is to have our funding partners continue to contribute and help us expand this community school model. We cannot do that without that help.
Brian, thank you. Reuben, what's the most important thing on your mind we didn't talk about tonight that folks need to hear?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation to come here, and thank you to this audience. This has just been really incredible to be a part of, and I'm so grateful for your active participation through the questions and otherwise. What I don't think we talked enough about is the importance of leadership in community schools, from the superintendent to the coordinator, to the principal, to all of you in the community. Leadership is a way that we handle the financial problems. It's the way that we build capacity. It's the way that we coordinate. And we have to do more of it, and we have you here.
Jose, most important thing on your mind we didn't get a chance to talk about tonight?
Most important thing for me is just to leave with understanding it starts with you yourself. I understand the busyness. I have 5 adults now, but I have 5 children. I'm the president of my homeowners association, and I'm on a plane, and sleeping in hotel rooms the majority of the fall, especially, and maybe early spring. But it doesn't stop me from contributing my finances, even to my local community. It doesn't stop me when I'm home, getting out there and volunteering, even in community schools right now. And it doesn't stop me for actually bringing my neighbors involved to not just support us as a homeowners association, but where's the nearest school we can get involved with it. That doesn't stop me from doing any of that. It stops me from getting sleep maybe, but I think the number one vehicle of making this work for any type of community, and go back to what the people is, to make it less transactional, that I just give $1 and I think it's gonna be solved, but make it more transformational for yourself as well. I'll just leave it at that.
Jose Munoz, Reuben Jacobson, Brian Polito, United Way, Erie Insurance, all the sponsors, you, the audience, thank you so much for a wonderful evening.